One company decides how much 90 million Americans pay to keep a roof over their heads. One company determines whether your landlord is allowed to drop your rent. One company sets the price of shelter for more than 3 million apartments across 43 states. You've heard of the housing crisis. You've felt the inflation. But you almost certainly don't know the name of the software that is quietly dictating the cost of your living room, or why the United States government just declared its entire operating model completely illegal under a 100-year-old antitrust law. The company is called RealPage, and its algorithmic pricing formula doesn't just track your rent, it traps it, using a cartel-style network of private, non-public data stolen directly from the neighbors living next door to you. That changes in the next 12 minutes. Here's the part that should stop you cold. RealPage's landlord clients don't call each other. They don't meet in a room and agree on a number. They don't have to. Every night, competing property managers feed their real rents, their real vacancy rates, their real lease terms into RealPage's algorithm. The algorithm pools all of it together, then hands each landlord a recommended price back, built in part from what their supposed competitors are quietly charging. Software takes the phone call that would be illegal and turns it into code. One landlord using the software put it in writing, and prosecutors quoted it directly in the lawsuit. That's classic price fixing. Not a tenant, not a critic, a paying customer, describing RealPage's own product back to itself. For over a decade, RealPage did through software what would have gotten landlords indicted if they'd done it over the phone. Filed in a Greensboro, North Carolina courtroom, the Justice Department's case, joined by 10 state attorneys general, accuses the company of running a cartel under the same law that broke up Standard Oil in 1911. RealPage was originally built as ordinary property management software in the late 1990s, but its pricing engine, called YieldStar, launched in 2003, borrowing the same yield management logic airlines use to price seats. For nearly 2 decades, almost nobody outside the industry knew it existed. That changed in October 2022, when ProPublica published an investigation showing landlords were feeding YieldStar their actual rents, actual vacancies, and actual lease terms, and receiving a recommended price back, built in part from what their competitors were charging next door. The scale came from one deal. In 2017, RealPage paid $300 million for its biggest rival, a company called Rainmaker, whose pricing product was named LRO, Lease Rent Options. The acquisition doubled the number of apartments RealPage's software priced from roughly 1.5 million units to 3 million overnight. The Justice Department reviewed the merger and let it proceed. RealPage's own marketing later invited landlords to see how the software could help them outperform the market by 3 to 7%, a promise that only works if your competitors aren't independently setting their own prices. Here's exactly how the mechanism runs. RealPage staff place tens of thousands of calls a week to landlords, gathering non-public data, real rents, real concessions, real occupancy, none of which appears in any public listing. That data drawn from thousands of competing buildings gets pooled inside one shared algorithm. Each night, the algorithm reprocesses the pool and pushes a new recommended price to every subscribed property by morning. Prosecutors say the software drew on pricing data from more than 16 million apartment units, competitively sensitive information no single landlord could legally obtain by simply asking a rival. 2 features made the recommendation stick. An auto-accept setting pushed the suggested price directly into a landlord's system unless a manager manually intervened, friction that discouraged rejecting it. A price floor kept the algorithm from ever recommending a rate low enough to undercut the group. Former employees told ProPublica that landlords accepted the software's recommendations roughly 90% of the time. By the time the lawsuit was filed, RealPage controlled an estimated 80% of this pricing software market, used across more than 40 metro areas. Look at what that looked like on the ground. In one downtown Seattle zip code, ProPublica found 70% of more than 9,000 apartments were controlled by just 10 property managers, and every one of them used RealPage's pricing software in at least some buildings. At one complex near Amazon's headquarters, rent rose 42% from 2012 onward, outpacing the 33% average for comparable nearby buildings. At another property, a manager watched the software push rates so high that leasing slowed down to a crawl, in her words, before the company overruled its own algorithm. In August 2024, the Justice Department sued RealPage directly, alleging violations of both Section 1 and Section 2 of the Sherman Act, price fixing and monopolization. The complaint quoted RealPage's own language back at it. The software existed to help landlords capture, quote, every possible opportunity to increase price, operating on the logic that a rising tide raises all ships. Assistant Attorney General Jonathan Cantor called it a business built on, quote, frustrating the natural forces of vigorous competition. RealPage called the case flawed and said it would fight it. 5 months later, the Justice Department sued 6 of the country's largest landlords directly, including Greystar, the nation's biggest, accusing them of coordinating through RealPage's shared algorithm and its private user group meetings. Together, those 6 managed more than 1.3 million apartments across 43 states. RealPage wasn't an isolated case either. The same period, the DOJ was separately pursuing meat processors over a similar data pooling scheme called AgriStats, and private plaintiffs were suing Las Vegas hotel chains over shared pricing software from a company called Sendin. The mechanism kept reappearing. The RealPage case reached a resolution first. On November 24, 2024, the company agreed to a settlement with the Justice Department. Under the deal, RealPage can no longer feed real-time, non-competitor data into its pricing recommendations. Any non-competitor data it uses going forward must be at least a year old. A court-appointed monitor will oversee the company for 3 years. Announcing the settlement, Assistant Attorney General Gail Slater said plainly, RealPage was replacing competition with coordination, and renters paid the price. The landlords settled too. Greystar alone agreed to pay $50 million to resolve a class action lawsuit from tenants, plus another $7 million to settle claims brought by 9 states. More than 24 other property management companies reached their own settlements over their use of RealPage's software. None of the settlements required anyone to admit wrongdoing, but collectively, they represent one of the largest algorithmic price-fixing resolutions in American history. And the case against RealPage's monopoly claims is still active in federal court. Regulators didn't wait for the courts to finish. California and New York's governors both signed laws last year specifically targeting algorithmic rent-setting software. San Francisco, Philadelphia, Minneapolis, and Seattle passed local ordinances banning landlords from using shared pricing algorithms built on competitor data. 10 state attorneys general joined the federal case against RealPage. What started as one company's product has become one of the fastest-moving areas of antitrust enforcement in the country, and it's rewriting the rules for every industry that prices with a shared algorithm, not just apartments. For renters, the immediate takeaway is leverage. If your building uses a revenue management platform, RealPage, Yardi, Entrata, or something similar, you can ask your leasing office directly, and under several new state laws, they may be required to disclose it. Negotiating a renewal against an algorithm is different from negotiating against a person. The software rarely drops below its floor voluntarily, but human managers retain override authority, and the settlements now restrict how aggressively that floor can be set in the first place. Renewal timing, occupancy data, and a documented ask still move the number. For property operators, the exposure isn't limited to RealPage. Any platform that pools competitor pricing data into a shared recommendation now sits inside active Justice Department scrutiny, following the same legal theory used against RealPage, AgriStats, and the hotel software cases. Compliance counsel are advising clients to audit exactly what data flows into any third-party pricing tool, disable auto-accept features by default, and keep a paper trail showing independent human judgment on every price. The distinction that matters legally is whether a real decision sits between the recommendation and the rent charged. For founders building in proptech, the opening isn't a loophole around antitrust law. It's the demand for pricing tools that don't require pooling non-public competitor data to work. Software that prices off a landlord's own occupancy, its own lease history, and genuinely public listings sits outside the legal theory that took down RealPage's model. Transparent, single-property pricing engines, tenant-facing rent comparison tools, and compliance software that flags collusion risk for legal teams are all categories with almost no incumbent, built for a market regulators are actively reshaping right now. The early movers already understand something simple. The legal model that let one algorithm quietly set prices for millions of renters is being dismantled market by market, and whatever replaces it will be built by whoever ships the transparent version first. A handful of proptech startups are already marketing audit-clean pricing tools built explicitly around the new consent decree's rules. Public data only, no real-time competitor feeds, full disclosure to tenants. That isn't a defensive feature added for optics. In this climate, it's the entire sales pitch. The pattern extends well past apartments. Pork producers, hotel chains, and now apartment landlords have all faced the identical legal question. Does feeding your private pricing data into one shared algorithm alongside your competitors count as an agreement to fix prices, even if no human ever picks up a phone? Courts have split on hotels, sided with prosecutors on RealPage, and are still deciding on pork. Every one of those rulings becomes precedent for the next industry: insurance, freight, healthcare staffing, anywhere a shared algorithm quietly sets the number everyone ends up paying. RealPlace was never a rogue actor. It was the visible test case for a question every industry with a dominant pricing platform will eventually face. The technology that made algorithmic coordination possible, pooling data at scale, updating prices nightly, invisible to the people paying them, didn't require anyone to break the law on purpose. It just made breaking it efficient, deniable, and profitable for over a decade, until a reporter's questions and a federal antitrust division decided efficient wasn't the same thing as legal. 3 million apartments, one algorithm, 0 phone calls. That was the whole scheme, and now it's the whole warning. Subscribe to the channel so you always know what's changing, and more importantly, what to do about it. Take care, and I'll see you next week.